The iron bars of Tanapa's jailhouse clanged shut with a finality that made Lillian Blackburn's heart sink to her worn leather boots. Sheriff Wade Thornton's smug expression, as he turned the key, told her everything she needed to know justice wasn't part of his vocabulary, at least not when it interfered with his own interests. "You'll hang for horse thieving by week's end, Miss Blackburn," Thornton said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to power. "Unless, of course, you reconsider my offer of alternative arrangements." Lillian turned away, disgust crawling up her spine. It was 1878, and in Tanapa, Nevada, a woman alone had few friends and fewer rights. At 22, she'd come west to claim her late uncle's small ranch, only to find Sheriff Thornton had other ideas about the property's rightful ownership. "I'd rather hang than accept your arrangement, Sheriff," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear threatening to choke her. "We both know I never stole that horse." "Your word against mine, Miss Blackburn," he said with a shrug that made his silver star catch the lamplight. "And in this town, my word is law." Lillian watched him leave, fighting back tears of frustration. The charge was absurd. She'd been accused of stealing her own horse, one her uncle had left her in his will. But Thornton had produced a witness claiming the animal belonged to a local businessman, a close associate of the sheriff's with eyes on her uncle's water rights. Night fell over Tanapa, bringing with it the raucous sounds of the saloons and the bone-deep chill of the desert after dark. Lillian huddled on the thin jailhouse cot, wrapping her arms around herself. She wouldn't give Thornton the satisfaction of hearing her cry. She must have dozed off despite her determination to stay alert, because a soft scraping sound at the window jerked her awake. Lillian froze, her eyes straining in the darkness. Miss Blackburn?" The whisper was barely audible. Lillian rose cautiously, approaching the small barred window. A man's face appeared in the moonlight, not one she recognized. "Who are you?" she whispered back. "Name's Zachary Alden." "Friends call me Zach." His voice was low and urgent. "And I'm about to become the best friend you've got in Tanapa." "I don't know you," Lillian replied warily. "No, madam, you don't." There was a hint of a smile in his voice. "But I know Thornton. And I know what happens to folks who get in his way." His eyes, vivid blue even in the darkness, met hers. "I also know you're innocent. Why would you help me?" Suspicion colored her tone. "Let's just say the sheriff and I have unfinished business." The man Zachary glanced over his shoulder. "Now listen carefully. Tomorrow night, Thornton's deputy will be alone. Man can't resist a poker game when one breaks out at the Gilded Lily. I'll create a distraction and you'll have a chance to get out. Be ready." Before Lillian could question him further, he vanished into the night, leaving her with a dangerous spark of hope. True to the stranger's word, the next evening found Deputy Mills alone at his desk, thumbing through a tattered dime novel while Lillian pretended to sleep. The clock had just struck 9 when shouting erupted from the street. "Fire! Fire at the hotel!" Mills jumped up, hesitating as he glanced at Lillian's seemingly sleeping form. The shouting intensified, and with a muttered curse, he grabbed his keys and rushed out, locking the door behind him. Seconds later, the lock clicked again. The door swung open, revealing Zachary Alden, a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. "Time to go, Miss Blackburn," he said, tossing a bundle of clothing at her. "Put these on quick. We've got about 3 minutes before someone notices there's no actual fire." "This is madness," Lillian whispered, even as she pulled the man's clothing over her own. "They'll hunt us down." "Probably," Zachary agreed, handing her a battered hat, "but they'll have to catch us first." "Tuck your hair up." Lillian obeyed, stuffing her long auburn hair beneath the hat. Zachary nodded approvingly, then led her out through the back door of the jailhouse. 2 horses waited in the shadows. "That's my horse," Lillian exclaimed, recognizing her uncle's Palomino mare. "Figured you might want her back," Zachary said, the corners of his eyes crinkling in what she guessed was a smile beneath the bandana. "Borrowed her from the livery. Man owed me a favor." They mounted quickly, Zachary leading them down a narrow alley away from the commotion. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs as they kept to a walk, resisting the urge to gallop wildly out of town. "Act natural," Zachary murmured as they reached the edge of Tonopah. "Just two cowpokes riding out for night work." They passed a group of men rushing toward the supposed fire, none of whom gave them a second glance. Only when the lights of Tonopah faded behind them did Zachary push his horse into a canter, with Lillian following suit. They rode for hours, the desert landscape ghostly under the silver light of a waxing moon. When they finally stopped to rest, they were deep in the foothills, beside a small spring hidden among boulders. "We should be safe here until morning," Zachary said, dismounting and removing his bandana. In the moonlight, Lillian could see him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25 or 26, with a lean, weathered face and those striking blue eyes she'd glimpsed through the jail window. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. "Why did you help me?" Lillian asked again as he unsaddled the horses. Zachary was silent for a long moment. "Thornton has a habit of finding wealthy landowners without family, especially women, and bringing charges against them. Once they're convicted, their property gets auctioned. His friends buy it cheap, and he gets a cut." His voice hardened. "My sister owned a small silver claim outside of Austin. He did the same to her 2 years ago." "What happened to her?" Lillian asked softly. "She didn't make it out of his jail." The words fell between them like stones. "Thornton claimed she hung herself from grief over her crimes." His hand stilled on the saddle straps. "Elizabeth would never have done that," understanding dawned on Lillian. "So this is revenge." Zachary shook his head. "This is justice. I've been tracking his schemes across Nevada for months, gathering evidence. You're the 5th person I've helped escape his false charges. Where will we go?" Lillian asked. "I have a place," Zachary replied, spreading a blanket on the ground for her. "An old line shack in the Toyabe Range. No one knows about it except me." "And then what?" Zachary's expression was grim in the moonlight. "Then we gather more evidence, find the others he's wronged, and bring Thornton down. Legally." Lillian sank onto the blanket, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. "Why not just shoot him? This is Nevada, after all." "Because then we'd be no better than him," Zachary replied simply. "Get some sleep, Miss Blackburn. We have a long ride ahead tomorrow." Lillian lay down, watching as her rescuer settled across the small campfire he'd built. "Lillian," she said softly, "if we're to be outlaws together, you might as well call me Lillian." His smile, when it came, transformed his serious face. "Good night then, Lillian." "Good night, Zach." Dawn came too soon, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold. Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Zachary studying a worn map. "We need to move," he said without preamble. "Thornton will have riders out by now." They ate a hurried breakfast of jerky and hardtack, then mounted up. The day promised to be scorching, the Nevada sun already beating down mercilessly. "It's about 30 miles to the line shack," Zachary explained as they rode. "We'll stick to the high ground where possible, keep to the shadows. Less chance of leaving tracks for them to follow." For hours, they rode in companionable silence, winding through canyons and across rocky plateaus where their horses' hooves left minimal traces. Zachary proved to be a skilled woodsman, occasionally backtracking or having them ride through shallow streams to break their trail. By midday, the heat was oppressive. They stopped in the shade of a sandstone overhang, watering the horses from their precious canteens. "How did you end up in Tanapa?" Zachary asked, leaning against the sun-warmed rock. Lillian sighed, pushing back her hat to wipe sweat from her brow. "My Uncle James homesteaded there 20 years ago, built a small ranch, found water when others couldn't." She smiled at the memory. "He was a stubborn old coot, but he was family. When my parents died of the fever back in Ohio, he was all I had left. So you came west?" "I came west," she confirmed. "Arrived 3 weeks ago to find he'd passed in his sleep, left everything to me in his will." "Everything was in order until Sheriff Thornton started sniffing around. Let me guess, your uncle's land has water rights." Lillian nodded. "A year-round spring, valuable in these parts, and Thornton wants it, or his friend Mr. Davis does. The same man who conveniently remembered I'd stolen his horse." Lillian's mouth twisted bitterly. "3 days after I refused to sell to him." Zachary nodded, unsurprised. "It fits the pattern. Thornton's getting bolder, though. Usually he gives newcomers a few months to settle before he makes his move." "Lucky me," Lillian said dryly. Zachary studied her, his expression thoughtful. "You're taking all this remarkably well. Most folks I've rescued have been in pieces by now." Lillian shrugged, though the casual gesture belied her inner turmoil. "I've learned that falling apart rarely solves problems. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I'm saving my breakdown for when we're truly safe." This drew a genuine laugh from Zachary. "Fair enough, we should keep moving." They mounted up and continued their journey, climbing higher into the mountains as the afternoon wore on. Twice, they spotted dust in the distance that might have been riders, and each time Zachary led them into rocky terrain where they couldn't be followed easily. As the sun began its descent, Lillian noticed Zachary growing tense, frequently checking their back trail. "What's wrong?" she finally asked. "We're being followed," he said grimly. "I've spotted the same rider 3 times now, keeping his distance but definitely tracking us." Fear clutched at Lillian's throat. "Thornton?" "No," Zachary said, "but likely one of his men. We need to split up." "What? No." The prospect of being alone again terrified her more than she cared to admit. "Just temporarily," Zachary assured her. "There's a box canyon about a mile ahead. You'll hide there with the horses while I circle back and deal with our shadow." "Deal with him how?" Lillian asked warily. "Nothing permanent," Zachary promised. "Just need to have a conversation about the merits of returning to Tanapa and forgetting what he's seen." Lillian wasn't convinced, but she followed his directions, leading both horses into the narrow canyon while Zachary disappeared into the rocky terrain on foot, rifle in hand. The waiting was excruciating. As minutes stretched into an hour, Lillian found herself imagining increasingly terrible scenarios. Zachary shot dead, the tracker bringing back reinforcements, Sheriff Thornton himself appearing at the canyon's entrance with that self-satisfied smile. When a pebble clattered down from above, Lillian nearly cried out. She whirled, reaching for the revolver Zachary had given her, only to find him descending the canyon wall with nimble ease. "It's just me," he said quickly, noting her defensive posture. "All clear." Relief washed over her. "What happened?" "Our friend decided Thornton doesn't pay him enough to tangle with me." There was something in Zachary's tone that suggested more to the story, but his expression discouraged questions. "We should reach the cabin before nightfall if we push on." The lined shack, when they finally reached it as the last light faded from the sky, was little more than a crude one-room structure built against the side of a cliff. But it had solid walls, a sturdy roof, and was virtually invisible until you were right upon it. Inside was sparse but tidy: a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with canned goods and staples, and a narrow cot pushed against one wall. A second sleeping area had been fashioned from blankets near the stove. "It's not much," Zachary said, sounding almost apologetic as he lit a lantern, "but it's safe." "It's perfect," Lillian replied honestly. After the jail cell and the grueling ride, any shelter seemed luxurious. They settled into a domestic routine with surprising ease. Zachary tending to the horses in a small corral hidden among the pines while Lillian explored the cabin's supplies and started a meal from the provisions. By the time he returned, she had beans simmering on the stove and cornbread baking. "You can cook," he observed, washing up at the basin by the door. "Did you think I couldn't?" Lillian asked, arching an eyebrow. "Wasn't sure what they teach young ladies back in Ohio." "This young lady grew up on a farm," she replied. "I can cook, so shoot straight and birth a calf if needed. Though I draw the line at shoeing horses, never had the strength for it." A genuine smile spread across Zachary's face. "You're a surprise, Lillian Blackburn." "I'll take that as a compliment," she said, feeling an unexpected warmth at his approval. "Now sit down and eat. You must be famished." Over their simple meal, Zachary explained more about his plan. "We'll stay here a few weeks, let things cool down in Tonopah. I have contacts a circuit judge in Carson City who's been building a case against Thornton for years, a newspaper editor in Virginia City who's not afraid to print the truth. We need to get your story to them." "And then what?" Lillian asked. "Even with a judge and a newspaper on our side, it's our word against the sheriff's." "Not just ours," Zachary said, leaning forward. "Like I said, you're the fifth person I've helped escape Thornton's false charges. The others are scattered across Nevada and California, all willing to testify. Plus, I've been keeping records, dates, names, property seizures, suspicious deaths. It's all documented." Lillian studied him with new respect. "You've been busy." 2 years' worth of busy," he agreed. "Thornton's been sheriff for 5 years. In that time, 12 properties have changed hands under suspicious circumstances. 7 people have died in his jail before they could stand trial." "Including your sister," Lillian said softly. Zachary nodded, his expression darkening. "Elizabeth was 20, had a good claim, worked it herself. Thornton accused her of stealing mining equipment. She died 3 days later." "I'm sorry," Lillian said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. The contact was brief, but she felt him tense, then relax beneath her fingers. "Get some rest," he said, standing abruptly. "You take the cot, I'll sleep by the stove." Lillian wanted to protest, but exhaustion was overtaking her. She nodded, retreating to the narrow bed while Zachary banked the fire for the night. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her. The events of the past 2 days kept replaying in her mind: the cold jail cell, the terrifying escape, the desperate flight across the desert. And then there was the man sleeping across the room, this stranger who had risked everything to save her. "Zach," she whispered into the darkness. "Hum." His voice was alert. He hadn't been sleeping either. "Thank you for everything." There was a long pause before he replied. "Get some sleep, Lillian. We're safe here." Somehow she believed him. The days at the line shack fell into a pattern. Zachary would rise before dawn, check their perimeter, and sometimes disappear for hours, scouting the surrounding area to ensure they hadn't been discovered. Lillian kept the cabin in order, cooked their meals, and slowly began to feel human again after her ordeal. On the 4th day, Zachary returned from his morning patrol with a rabbit for their dinner. As he taught Lillian how to dress the game, their hands brushed repeatedly, each contact sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked, trying to distract herself from his proximity. "The tracking, living off the land." "My father was a trapper," Zachary replied, his skilled hands working the knife. Raised Elizabeth and me in the mountains after our mother died. He taught us everything he knew. He must be proud of you. A shadow crossed Zachary's face. He was killed by Paiutes when I was 16. Elizabeth and I made our way to Austin after that. She took in washing while I worked the mines. I'm sorry, Lillian said again, feeling inadequate. You've lost so much. He shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both acceptance and lingering pain. Life out here is rarely kind. You adapt or you perish. Is that what you're doing now, adapting? Zachary's hand stilled on the rabbit. No, he said softly. This isn't about adaptation. This is about making things right. That evening, as they ate their rabbit stew, Zachary seemed lost in thought, occasionally glancing at Lillian when he thought she wouldn't notice. What is it? She finally asked. I need to leave tomorrow, he said. Just for a few days. Fear immediately clutched at Lillian's heart. Leave? Where? Carson City. I need to get a message to Judge Morrison, let him know about your case. He must have seen the panic in her eyes because he added quickly, You'll be safe here. No one knows about this place. What if Thornton's men find me? The prospect of being alone, vulnerable, had her throat tightening. Zachary reached across the table, his calloused fingers closing over hers. They won't. But if you're worried, I can show you a hiding place, a cave system behind the waterfall about a mile from here. It's virtually invisible unless you know where to look. Lillian wanted to protest further, but she understood the logic. They couldn't hide forever, they needed allies, needed to move their plan forward. I'll be fine, she said with more confidence than she felt. Just come back quickly. 3 days, he promised. 4 at most. He left at dawn the next morning, showing Lillian the hiding place as promised, and leaving her with extra ammunition for the revolver. The cabin felt cavernous without his presence, the silence oppressive where before it had been peaceful. Lillian kept herself busy, meticulously cleaning every corner of the small dwelling, taking inventory of their supplies, and even venturing to the nearby stream to wash clothes. At night, she found herself unable to sleep on the cot, instead curling up in the blankets near the stove where Zachary had slept, finding odd comfort in the lingering scent of him. On the 3rd day, as she was gathering firewood near the cabin, a sound froze her in place. Hoofbeats, approaching slowly. She dropped the wood and ran for the cabin, grabbing the revolver from where she kept it under her pillow. Heart racing, she positioned herself beside the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the shutters. Relief flooded her when she recognized Zachary's buckskin horse, though it quickly turned to concern when she saw him slumped in the saddle. Lillian rushed outside, reaching him just as he half fell, half dismounted. You're hurt, she exclaimed, noting the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. It's nothing, he grunted, leaning heavily against her as she helped him toward the cabin. Just a graze. Once inside, she eased him into a chair and quickly unbuttoned his shirt. The wound was indeed a bullet graze, but it was deep and angry looking, the surrounding skin hot to the touch. This isn't nothing, Lillian said sharply. What happened? Zachary winced as she began cleaning the wound with water and whiskey. Ran into some of Thornton's men outside Carson City. They're patrolling all the roads. Did they recognize you? Don't think so. Got away before they got a good look. He hissed as she probed the wound. But they're looking for both of us. Thornton's put out a substantial reward. Lillian's hands faltered. How substantial? $500 each. Zachary's eyes met hers. Dead or alive. The implication wasn't lost on Lillian. A reward that size would attract every bounty hunter and opportunist in Nevada territory. Did you at least reach the judge? She asked, resuming her ministrations with shaking hands. Zachary nodded, grimacing as she began stitching the wound closed with needle and thread from her small sewing kit. He was already building a case. Your situation adds another layer of evidence. He's going to arrange a federal marshal to investigate Thornton. How long will that take? Weeks, maybe months. Zachary closed his eyes, his face pale. Politics moves slowly, even for corruption this blatant. Lillian finished bandaging his shoulder in silence, her mind racing. Weeks or months in hiding with a price on their heads. It seemed impossible. "We'll figure it out," Zachary said, as if reading her thoughts. His good hand caught hers, squeezing gently. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." The earnestness in his voice made something flutter in Lillian's chest. "I'm more worried about you," she admitted. "You're the one bleeding." A hint of his usual smile ghosted across his lips. "Takes more than a bullet graze to stop me." That night, Lillian insisted Zachary take the cot, despite his protests. She checked his wound regularly, concerned about infection, and by morning was relieved to find the angry redness had receded somewhat. For the next week, they existed in a state of heightened vigilance. Zachary recovered quickly, though Lillian insisted he avoid exerting his injured arm. This forced proximity, with him confined to the cabin and its immediate surroundings, shifted something in their relationship. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their losses. Lillian told him about her childhood in Ohio, the illness that took her parents, her decision to come west rather than marry the banker's son who had been courting her. "Why didn't you marry him?" Zachary asked as they sat by the stove one evening, a game of checkers between them. Lillian moved her piece, capturing one of his. "He wanted a proper wife to host dinner parties and bear his children, nothing more." "And you wanted more." "I wanted a partnership," she said simply. "Someone who would see me as an equal, not an ornament or a convenience." She glanced up, finding Zachary's intense gaze on her. "I wanted adventure, I suppose, though I didn't quite bargain for this much excitement." His laugh was warm, wrapping around her like a blanket. "Life has a way of exceeding our expectations, good and bad." As Zachary healed, he began teaching Lillian more survival skills: how to move silently through the forest, how to track game, how to read the weather from cloud patterns. She proved an apt pupil, and he an unexpectedly patient teacher. "You're a natural," he said one afternoon as she successfully tracked a deer to its bedding area. "Most city folks never develop the eye for it." "I told you I grew up on a farm," Lillian reminded him, secretly pleased by his praise. "And I've always been observant." "What do you observe about me?" Zachary asked suddenly, his expression unreadable. The question caught Lillian off guard. She studied him for a moment, the way he stood with his weight balanced, ready for movement, the vigilant eyes that constantly scanned their surroundings, the hands that could be so gentle with her, yet so capable of violence when needed. "I see someone who's lived with pain for a long time," she said finally. "Someone who's turned that pain into purpose. You're dangerous but not cruel, careful but not fearful." She paused. "And lonely, very lonely." Zachary's expression shifted, vulnerability flashing across his features before he schooled them back to neutrality. "You are observant," he said softly. They stood there in the dappled forest light, something unspoken passing between them, until a distant bird call broke the spell. "We should head back," Zachary said, clearing his throat. "Storm coming." That night, rain pounded the roof of the cabin, the wind howling through the surrounding pines. They sat close to the stove for warmth, Zachary teaching Lillian how to play poker with a worn deck of cards. "You're letting me win," she accused after her third consecutive victory. "I wouldn't dare," he protested, though his eyes danced with amusement. "You're just naturally lucky." "Or you're a terrible poker player," she teased, gathering the cards to shuffle. "Maybe I'm just distracted," Zachary said, his voice dropping lower. Lillian looked up, her fingers stilling on the cards. The way he was looking at her made her breath catch. Distracted by what? She asked, though she knew the answer. Zachary reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. By you, by all of you. The confession hung between them, as tangible as the heat from the stove. Lillian leaned into his touch, her heart hammering against her ribs. Zach, she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. He hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. This is a bad idea, he murmured, even as he leaned closer. We're in danger. You're vulnerable. I'm thinking too much, Lillian finished for him, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was tentative, questioning. Their second was anything but. Zachary's arms encircled her, drawing her against him as the kiss deepened, weeks of tension and growing affection crystallizing into desperate need. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. I promised myself I wouldn't do this, he confessed. Wouldn't complicate things. Life is already complicated, Lillian replied, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. This might be the only simple thing about it. Later, as they lay tangled together on the narrow cot, the storm still raging outside, Lillian felt a peace she hadn't known since before her parents' deaths. Whatever dangers awaited them, whatever challenges they still faced, they would face them together. What are you thinking? Zachary asked, his voice drowsy as he trailed fingers along her bare shoulder. That for the first time in a long while I'm exactly where I want to be, she answered truthfully. His arms tightened around her. Even with a price on your head and a corrupt sheriff hunting you, even then, she confirmed, though I could do without those particular complications. They fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof, finding refuge in each other that had nothing to do with the physical shelter of the cabin. The following weeks brought an uneasy routine. They remained vigilant, never straying far from the cabin, always prepared to flee at the first sign of trouble. Yet within these constraints, they found moments of surprising joy hunting together, improving the cabin, sharing stories by lamplight, and discovering each other in the quiet hours of night. Zachary began teaching Lillian to shoot with his rifle, not just the revolver she already handled competently. You've got a good eye, he said approvingly as she hit the makeshift target he'd set up. Steady hands, too. I pray I never have to use these skills against a person, Lillian said, lowering the rifle. Zachary's expression sobered. So do I, but if it comes to it, I want you to be able to defend yourself. His hand covered hers on the rifle stock. Promise me something? What? If anything happens to me, you run. You head for Carson City, find Judge Morrison. His office is, nothing is going to happen to you, Lillian interrupted fiercely. Lillian, Zachary said, his tone gentle but insistent. Promise me. She wanted to refuse, to pretend they weren't living under a constant threat, but the reality was inescapable. I promise, she finally said, but you have to make the same promise. If something happens to me, it won't, he said with sudden ferocity. I won't let it. They were gathering wild berries near the stream the next day when Zachary suddenly tensed, his hand going to the revolver at his hip. What is it? Lillian whispered, instantly alert. Smoke, he said, nodding toward the horizon. Campfire smoke. Someone's nearby. They abandoned their berry picking and returned to the cabin, moving silently through the underbrush. Once inside, Zachary quickly gathered essentials into saddlebags. We need to move, he said. Could be innocent travelers, but I can't take that chance. Where will we go? Lillian asked, packing food supplies with practiced efficiency. There's another place, about 20 miles north, not as comfortable but even more remote. They saddled the horses and left within the hour, traveling cross-country to avoid any established trails. Zachary led them through a labyrinth of narrow canyons and dense forest, occasionally doubling back or creating false trails. By nightfall, they reached their new sanctuary, a natural cave set high in a cliff face, accessible only by a narrow, winding path. The interior was surprisingly spacious, with a small natural chimney that would allow smoke to disperse without being easily visible. "How did you find this place?" Lillian asked, amazed as they settled in. "Spent a lot of time in these mountains," Zachary replied, arranging their bedrolls. "After Elizabeth died, I couldn't stand to be around people much. Took to wandering." "Until you decided to bring Thornton to justice," Lillian said, understanding dawning. Zachary nodded. "Grief can only sustain you so long. Eventually, you either find purpose or you fade away." Lillian moved to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. "I'm glad you found purpose," she said softly, "though I'm sorry for the circumstances." His arms encircled her, his cheek resting against her hair. "I'm starting to think I found something else, too," he murmured. "Something I wasn't looking for." She looked up, finding his gaze intense and questioning. "What's that?" "A future," he said simply. "After Thornton, after justice. A reason to keep going." The admission stole Lillian's breath. "Zach, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "It's too soon, I know. We're in an impossible situation and feelings get heightened in danger. Lillian rose on her toes and kissed him, cutting off his words. "My feelings aren't just because of our situation," she said when they parted. "They're real. You're real." Her hands framed his face. "And when this is over, whatever future you see, I want to be part of it." They made love there in the cave, their passion tempered with a new tenderness, promises exchanged without words. Later, as they lay entwined, Zachary tensed suddenly. "Did you hear that?" Lillian strained to listen, hearing only the soft whisper of wind outside. "No." What his hand covered her mouth, his eyes wide with warning. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a horse nickering, not far below their hideaway. They dressed silently, Zachary signaling for Lillian to stay back as he crept toward the narrow entrance, gun drawn. She watched, heart in throat, as he peered cautiously outside. He returned moments later, his expression grim. "3 riders," he whispered. "One of them is Deputy Mills from Tonopah." Cold fear washed over Lillian. "They found us." "Not yet," Zachary said. "They're making camp below." "Don't think they know about the cave." "What do we do?" Zachary considered their options. "We wait, see if they move on by morning. If not—" He hesitated. "If not, I'll create a diversion, draw them away. You take the back path I showed you when we arrived." "No," Lillian said immediately. "We stay together." "Lillian, no," she repeated more firmly. "I'm not leaving you to face 3 armed men alone. We're in this together, remember?" Frustration and admiration warred on Zachary's face. Finally, he nodded. "Together, then. But if shooting starts, you find cover and stay there." "Agreed." "Agreed," she said, though inwardly she made no such promise. They extinguished their small fire and retreated to the deepest part of the cave, wrapped in blankets against the night chill. Sleep was impossible. They took turns watching the entrance, ears straining for any sound of approach. Dawn came with agonizing slowness. As the first gray light filtered into the cave, Zachary crept to the entrance again. "They're still there," he reported when he returned. "Looks like they're settling in for a search of the area." "They must know we're close," Lillian said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "or they're just being thorough." Zachary began checking their weapons. "Either way, we need to move before they find this place." They packed quickly and silently, leaving only what they couldn't carry. Zachary led Lillian to the rear of the cave, where a narrow fissure opened into another passage. "This leads to a ledge about 50 feet down the other side of the ridge," he explained in a whisper. "It's a steep climb, but passable. Our horses are hidden in the grove below." The descent was harrowing, with barely enough footholds in places and a sheer drop to their right. Zachary went first, helping Lillian find secure places to step. They were halfway down when a shout echoed from above. "There!" On the cliff face, a shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the rock inches from Lillian's head. Zachary pulled her against the cliff wall, shielding her with his body as more shots followed. "Keep moving," he urged, drawing his revolver and firing back to give her cover. They scrambled downward, chips of rock flying around them as bullets continued to strike near them. Finally, they reached the grove where their horses waited, already saddled. "Ride," Zachary commanded, helping Lillian mount before swinging onto his own horse. They thundered out of the trees, heading for a narrow ravine that would provide cover. Behind them, they could hear their pursuers scrambling to reach their own mounts. The ravine opened into a broader valley, offering little concealment. Zachary led them toward a distant line of trees, pushing their horses to the limit. Lillian glanced back to see 3 riders emerging from the ravine behind them, gaining ground on fresher mounts. "They're catching up," she called to Zachary. He veered suddenly, leading them toward a rocky outcropping. This way, they reached the rocks just as a bullet whizzed past Lillian's ear. Zachary dismounted in one fluid motion, pulling her from her saddle. "Go!" he shouted, slapping the horses' rumps to send them running before pulling Lillian into the maze of boulders. They ran crouching among the rocks, the sound of hooves and angry voices following. Zachary found a natural depression between 2 large boulders and pushed Lillian down into it. "Stay here," he said, checking his revolver. "I'm going to circle around, try to pick them off one by one." "That's suicide," Lillian protested. "It's strategy," he countered. "They'll be expecting us to run, not fight back." He touched her cheek briefly. "Trust me." Before she could argue further, he was gone, moving silently among the rocks. Lillian drew her own revolver, heart pounding as she waited. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness. She heard the men dismount, their voices carrying as they discussed how to approach the rocks. Then a shot rang out, followed by a cry of pain. More gunfire erupted, the sound echoing chaotically among the boulders. Lillian couldn't tell who was shooting or where Zachary might be. When the firing stopped, an eerie silence descended. "Lillian," Zachary's voice, low and urgent. She nearly wept with relief. "Here." He appeared at the edge of her hiding place, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead but otherwise intact. "We need to move, now. The deputies, one's dead, one's wounded. Mills got away, heading back toward the cave." Zachary helped her up. "He'll bring reinforcements." They retrieved one of the deputies' horses and rode double, pushing hard for hours until they reached a small settlement nestled in a high mountain valley. Rather than entering the town proper, Zachary guided them to a modest cabin on its outskirts. He knocked in a pattern, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened to reveal an elderly man with a shock of white hair and piercing gray eyes. "Zachary Alden," the man said, glancing past him to Lillian. "Trouble follows you like a shadow, boy." "Hello to you too, Doc," Zachary replied with a hint of his old grin. "We need a place to lay low for a bit." The old man, Doc, sighed dramatically but stepped aside. "When do you not? Come in before someone sees you." The cabin's interior was cluttered but clean, shelves lined with books and medicinal supplies. Doc led them through to a back room furnished with a bed and a small table. "You can stay here," he said gruffly. "No one will look for you at the town doctor's place." "We appreciate it," Zachary said, clasping the older man's shoulder. Doc's attention had already shifted to the wound on Zachary's head. "Sit down before you fall down, you fool. Let me clean that." As Doc tended to Zachary's injury, he explained to Lillian, "This young reprobate pulled a bullet out of my leg 2 years ago when some less than satisfied patients decided I'd charged too much. Been patching him up ever since whenever he stumbles into my territory." "Which is far too often," Zachary added with a wince as the doctor applied antiseptic. "And you must be the young lady I've been hearing about," Doc continued, glancing at Lillian. "The one Sheriff Thornton is so determined to hang." Lillian tensed. "Word has reached even here." "Word travels fast in these parts, especially when it comes with a reward attached." Doc finished bandaging Zachary's head. $500 would buy a lot of whiskey for an enterprising individual. "Doc wouldn't turn us in," Zachary said, noting Lillian's discomfort. "He hates Thornton almost as much as I do. The man's a disgrace to his badge," Doc confirmed, packing away his supplies. "Arrested my nephew on false charges last year. Boy lost his business before I could get him out." He turned to Lillian. "You're safe here, Miss Blackburn, at least for now." That "for now" echoed in Lillian's mind as she and Zachary settled in for the night, sharing the narrow bed in Doc's back room. Their escape had been too close, the danger too real. "We can't keep running forever," she whispered into the darkness. Zachary's arm tightened around her. "We won't have to. Judge Morrison will have received my latest message by now. He knows we have 5 witnesses willing to testify. The federal marshal should be investigating already. And if he's not, if Thornton gets to us first—" Zachary was silent for a long moment. "Then we'll face it together," he finally said. "But I promise you this, if it comes to it, I'll die before I let him take you back to that jail." The fierce protectiveness in his voice both comforted and terrified her. "Don't talk about dying," she said, pressing closer to him. "We've come too far for that." "You're right," he conceded, kissing her forehead. "Let's talk about living instead, about what comes after." "After," Lillian repeated, letting the word fill her with hope. "Tell me what you see." In the darkness, Zachary painted a picture with words: a small ranch in a peaceful valley, horses grazing in green pastures, a garden for Lillian to tend, children running free under wide skies. A life built on honest work and shared love, far from the shadows of their current existence. Lillian fell asleep to these images, clutching them like talismans against the uncertain reality awaiting them at dawn. They stayed with Doc for 3 days, keeping to the back room during daylight hours. On the evening of the 3rd day, Doc returned from his rounds in town with troubling news. "Thornton himself is in Bitter Creek," he said without preamble, referring to the small town they were hiding in. "Got a dozen men with him, turning the place upside down looking for you too." Zachary and Lillian exchanged alarmed glances. "How did he know to look here?" Zachary asked. "Deputy Mills must have guessed you'd head this way," Doc replied. "Or they're just being thorough, checking every settlement within riding distance of where they lost your trail." "We need to leave," Lillian said immediately. "We're putting you in danger just by being here." Doc waved away her concern. "Been in danger most of my life, girl. Comes with the profession." Nevertheless, his expression was grave. "But you should go tonight. I've got a wagon you can use, less conspicuous than riding horseback right now." "Where can we go?" Lillian asked, the constant flight beginning to wear on her spirit. It was Zachary who answered, his expression resolute. "Carson City. It's time to stop running and take the fight to Thornton." "Carson City," Lillian repeated, shocked. "That's nearly 100 miles from here. And it's the first place they'll look for us. Which is why we'll hide in plain sight," Zachary explained. "The judge has friends, people willing to shelter us until the federal investigation is complete. We can disappear in a city in a way we can't out here in the open country." The plan was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but after weeks of flight and hiding, the prospect of taking action appealed to Lillian's determined nature. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Midnight," Doc answered. "I'll have the wagon ready. You'll travel as my niece and her husband, heading to Carson City to settle your late father's affairs." He provided them with suitable clothing, a respectable dress for Lillian, a proper coat and hat for Zachary, and identity papers that looked convincingly official. "You've done this before," Lillian observed as Doc explained the details of their cover story. The old man's eyes twinkled briefly. "Let's just say you're not the first folks who have needed to disappear from Thornton's reach." At midnight, as promised, the wagon was waiting behind the cabin, loaded with medical supplies as cover for their journey. Doc embraced them both before they climbed aboard. "Stay alive," he told them gruffly. "I want an invitation to your wedding when this is all over." Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Zachary merely grinned and clasped the old doctor's hand. "You'll get it," he promised. "And thank you." They set off under a canopy of stars, taking back roads and avoiding the main thoroughfares. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Bitter Creek, the wagon rolling steadily through sage-covered hills. "We'll stop at midday," Zachary said, noting Lillian's fatigue. "There's a friendly ranch about 10 miles ahead. We can rest there before pushing on." The ranch belonged to a taciturn widow named Mrs. Hawkins, who greeted them with suspicion until Zachary mentioned Doc's name. Her weathered face immediately softened. "Any friend of Doc's is welcome here," she said, ushering them inside her modest home. "You both look dead on your feet. There's stew on the stove and a bed you can use for a few hours." They ate gratefully, then fell into exhausted sleep in Mrs. Hawkins' spare room. Zachary woke Lillian as the sun began to set. "We should move on," he said softly. "Cover as much ground as possible during darkness." Mrs. Hawkins provided them with fresh supplies and information about patrols on the roads ahead. "Thornton's men were through here yesterday," she told them. "Asking questions, flashing those reward posters. Nobody around here said a word, mind you. The sheriff's not popular in these parts." They thanked her and continued their journey, traveling by night and resting during daylight hours in hidden locations. Progress was slower than they'd hoped, the need for caution adding days to their journey. A week into their travel, as they approached the outskirts of a small mining settlement, they encountered a roadblock, 4 armed men checking every passing vehicle. "Thornton's men," Zachary muttered, pulling the wagon off the road before they could be spotted. "We'll have to go around." The detour cost them another day, forcing them through rough terrain that the wagon barely managed to navigate. When they finally rejoined a passable road, both were exhausted and on edge. "We're still at least 3 days from Carson City," Zachary said as they made camp that night in a sheltered canyon. "Maybe more if we keep having to avoid patrols." Lillian could see the strain in his face, the weeks of vigilance and responsibility taking their toll. She moved to sit beside him, taking his rough hands in hers. "We'll make it," she said with quiet conviction. "We've come this far." Zachary's smile was weary but genuine. "When did you become the optimist between us?" "When I realized I had something worth fighting for," she replied simply. His expression softened as he drew her closer. "Lillian Blackburn, when this is over, I want the crack of a rifle shot cut through the night, the bullet splintering the wagon wheel inches from where they sat." Zachary shoved Lillian to the ground, covering her body with his own as more shots followed. "Stay down," he commanded, drawing his revolver and returning fire toward the muzzle flashes on the ridge above. "How did they find us?" Lillian gasped, fear and fury mingling in her voice. "Doesn't matter now," Zachary replied grimly. "We need to move. The wagon's a loss. Under cover of darkness, they abandoned their supplies, taking only weapons, water, and what food they could carry. Zachary led Lillian away from the camp, staying low and using the terrain for cover as bullets continued to rain down around them. They ran through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and their attackers. By dawn, they had reached a rocky plateau barren except for scrub brush and scattered boulders. "No cover here," Zachary said, surveying the exposed landscape. "We need to keep moving." But Lillian was swaying on her feet, exhaustion and dehydration taking their toll. Zachary caught her as she stumbled. "Just a short rest," he amended, guiding her to the shade of a large boulder. "Drink some water." They shared their dwindling water supply, conserving every precious drop. The day grew hotter, the sun beating down mercilessly on the plateau. By mid-afternoon, they were both suffering from the heat. "We need to find shelter before nightfall," Zachary said, his voice rough from thirst. "There should be a line of hills to the east that will provide some cover." They set off again, each step an effort in the baking heat. Lillian's vision began to blur, her thoughts fragmenting. She was vaguely aware of Zachary supporting her, his arm around her waist as they trudged forward. The sound of hoofbeats barely registered until Zachary suddenly pulled her behind an outcropping of rock. "Riders," he whispered, his hand going to his gun. Lillian blinked, trying to clear her vision. Through the heat haze, she could make out 3 figures on horseback, approaching slowly across the plateau. "Thornton's men?" she managed to ask. "Can't tell," Zachary replied. "But we can't outrun them in this condition." He checked his revolver, 3 bullets left. Lillian's gun was empty. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "If they're hostile, I'll hold them off. You run for those hills, don't look back." "No," Lillian protested weakly. "Together, remember." "Together in life," Zachary said, his eyes fierce. "But I won't watch you die if I can prevent it." The riders were closer now, their features becoming visible. Lillian felt Zachary tense beside her, then unexpectedly relax. "It's all right," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "I know them." Before Lillian could question him, Zachary stood, waving to the approaching riders. "Over here," he called. The lead rider spotted them and changed course, the others following. As they drew nearer, Lillian could see that one wore a badge, not a sheriff's star, but a different insignia she didn't recognize. "Marshal Reynolds," Zachary greeted the lead rider. "Your timing is impeccable." The marshal, a weathered man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard, dismounted with a grunt. "Zachary Alden. Should have known you'd be half dead in the desert when I found you." His gaze shifted to Lillian. "Miss Blackburn, I presume?" Lillian nodded, confused by this unexpected development. "U.S. Marshal James Reynolds," the man introduced himself. "Judge Morrison sent us to find you after your last message. Seems you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest with Sheriff Thornton." Relief washed over Lillian, so profound she might have collapsed if not for Zachary's supportive arm. "You're here to help us, to escort you safely to Carson City," the marshal confirmed, "and to serve a federal warrant on Thornton for corruption and abuse of office." He nodded to his companions. "My deputies have been tracking you for 2 days, lost your trail after the ambush last night." "You know about that?" Zachary asked sharply. "Found what was left of your wagon," one of the deputies supplied, "and 3 bodies nearby. Whoever was shooting at you ran into some of Thornton's regular patrols. Seems they had a disagreement about who'd collect the reward." "They killed each other," Lillian said, the irony not lost on her despite her exhaustion. "So it appears," the marshal agreed. "Now, let's get you 2 some water and proper shelter. You both look ready to drop." They rode double with the marshals to a small homestead where arrangements had been made for their shelter. After days of deprivation, the simple comforts of a real bed, hot food, and clean water seemed luxurious beyond measure. That evening, as Lillian and Zachary sat on the homestead's porch watching the sunset, Marshal Reynolds joined them with news. "Thornton's been arrested," he announced without preamble. "My men picked him up in Bitter Creek this morning." "Apparently he was so focused on finding you two that he didn't notice us closing in." "Just like that?" Lillian asked, disbelieving after weeks of fear and flight. "It's over." "Not quite," the marshal cautioned. "There's still a trial to face. You'll both need to testify, along with the other witnesses Zachary has gathered. But Thornton's in federal custody now, beyond the reach of his friends." "When do we need to be in Carson City?" Zachary asked, his hand finding Lillian's. 2 weeks, Reynolds replied. "Judge Morrison wants time to gather all the evidence before the trial begins." He studied them both, his expression softening slightly. "You two should rest until then. You're safe here." After the marshal left them alone, Lillian turned to Zachary, seeing her own wonder mirrored in his eyes. "Safe," she repeated, the word feeling foreign after so long. "I'm not sure I remember what that feels like." "We'll relearn it together," Zachary promised, drawing her close. Under the vast desert sky, with the immediate danger finally past, he completed the sentence that had been interrupted by gunfire days before. "Lillian Blackburn, when this is over, I want you to marry me." Joy bubbled up in Lillian's chest, unexpected and overwhelming after so much fear. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." His kiss tasted of promise and possibility, of a future once imperiled now suddenly within reach. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. They traveled to Carson City under martial escort, meeting with Judge Morrison and the prosecutor assigned to the case. Lillian was reunited with her uncle's Palomino mare, rescued from the Tanapa livery by one of the marshals. The trial itself lasted 5 days. Lillian testified about the false charges, her imprisonment, and the sheriff's inappropriate offer. Zachary presented his meticulously gathered evidence property records showing suspicious transfers, witness statements, documentation of suspicious deaths in Thornton's custody. Other witnesses came forward as well, previous victims of Thornton's schemes, who Zachary had helped escape. Townspeople who had observed his corruption, but been too afraid to speak up. Even Deputy Mills, who turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. On the 5th day, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. Judge Morrison sentenced Thornton to 20 years in the territorial prison, his badge and authority stripped away forever. As they left the courthouse, Lillian felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "What happens now?" she asked Zachary as they stood in the autumn sunshine. "Now," he said, a smile spreading across his face, "we start living." They were married the following week in Carson City, a small ceremony with Doc, Marshal Reynolds, and Judge Morrison in attendance. The judge, as a wedding gift, presented Lillian with papers confirming her legal ownership of her uncle's ranch in Tanapa. "It's rightfully yours," he told her, "though I understand if you choose not to return there." Zachary and Lillian exchanged glances, a silent communication that had become second nature during their weeks together. "We'll go back," Lillian decided. "Not right away, perhaps, but eventually. It's good land with good water. It shouldn't go to waste." "Besides," Zachary added, "running away permanently would feel too much like letting Thornton win, even from prison." They spent their first months of marriage traveling, visiting the places Zachary had discovered during his years of wandering hidden valleys, pristine lakes, ancient forests. They returned to Doc's cabin in Bitter Creek, where the old man welcomed them with gruff affection and demands to know when they would start providing him with grandchildren to spoil. "Give us time," Zachary laughed. "We've had enough excitement for a while." In the spring of 1879, they finally returned to Tonopah. The town had changed in their absence. A new sheriff, more attentive to justice than his predecessor. New businesses, new faces. But Lillian's uncle's ranch remained much as she remembered it, though somewhat neglected after months without proper care. They set to work immediately, repairing fences, tending the livestock that had survived, planting crops in the fertile soil near the spring. Neighbors who had once avoided the property, fearful of Thornton's interest in it, now came to welcome them, offering assistance and friendship. By summer, the ranch was flourishing. Zachary proved to be as skilled with growing things as he was with tracking and hunting. Lillian, using knowledge from her Ohio farm upbringing, established a productive vegetable garden and a small orchard that promised future bounty. In the cool of evening, they often sat on the porch Zachary had built, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in spectacular colors. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Lillian asked one such evening, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. "After everything we went through, not specifically here," Zachary admitted, his arm tightening around her. "But I always hoped we'd find peace somehow." He placed his free hand on her abdomen, where the first subtle swelling of their child was beginning to show. "And a future worth building." Lillian covered his hand with hers, marveling at how complete her life had become. From the terror of that jail cell to the contentment of this moment seemed an impossible journey, yet they had made it together. "I think your sister would be proud," she said softly, "of everything you've accomplished, the justice you've brought." Zachary was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I think she would," he finally agreed, "though she'd probably say I took the long way around to happiness." "The scenic route," Lillian corrected with a smile. "And I, for one, wouldn't change a single step of the path that brought us here." As darkness settled over the ranch, stars emerging in the vast Nevada sky, Lillian reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together: a false imprisonment, a daring rescue, a dangerous flight across the wilderness. What had begun in fear and desperation had transformed into something precious beyond measure. Their child was born the following winter, a healthy son they named James, after Lillian's uncle and, coincidentally, Marshall Reynolds, who became the boy's godfather. Doc made the journey from Bitter Creek despite the snow, pronouncing the infant sturdy enough in his typical understated fashion. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter, Elizabeth, named for Zachary's sister, arrived 2 years after James. Another son, Thomas, 3 years after that. The ranch prospered, expanding as they acquired adjacent properties. Zachary's reputation as a fair businessman and skilled rancher spread throughout the territory, while Lillian became known for her horsemanship and her involvement in establishing Tonopah's first proper school. They never forgot their beginnings, however. Each year, on the anniversary of Lillian's rescue from jail, they made a private pilgrimage to the Line Shack in the mountains where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. They maintained it as a retreat, a place of remembrance and gratitude. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat by the small stove in that humble cabin, Zachary presented Lillian with a journal, the detailed record he had kept of Thornton's crimes, the evidence that had eventually imprisoned the corrupt sheriff. "I've been carrying this for too long," he said as she turned the pages, recognizing his precise handwriting. "It's time to put it away for good." Lillian understood the significance of the gesture. This journal represented years of Zachary's life consumed by the pursuit of justice, by grief and determination. Letting it go was the final step in his healing. "Are you sure?" she asked, closing the book reverently. Zachary nodded, his eyes clear and peaceful in a way they hadn't been when they first met. "The past has its place, but it's not here anymore." He took her hand, the same calloused fingers that had once helped her escape now entwined with hers in the security of enduring love. "My life is with you and our children. That's where I want to stay." They buried the journal beneath the floorboards of the lined shack, a symbolic interment of the darkness that had once defined their lives. As they rode home together, the setting sun gilding the landscape in gold, Lillian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. From a jail cell in Tanapa to a life rich with love, family, and purpose, it wasn't the path she had envisioned when she first traveled west to claim her uncle's legacy. It was infinitely better. "What are you thinking?" Zachary asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Lillian smiled, the years having only deepened her love for this man who had risked everything to save a stranger from injustice. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she replied. "And that I'm grateful, every day, that you decided to break me out of that jail." Zachary's answering smile held all the warmth and tenderness of their shared years. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. As they rode toward home, toward the lights of their ranch where their children waited, Lillian knew it was true for both of them. What had begun as an act of justice had blossomed into a life neither could have imagined in those desperate first days, a life built on courage, commitment, and love that had proven stronger than any danger they faced. It was a story they would pass down to their children and grandchildren in the years to come, the tale of a corrupt sheriff, a daring rescue, and the unexpected journey that led to their enduring happiness in the wild, beautiful heart of Nevada.